Hey everybody, this video is called Welcome the New King, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Samuel, where we're going to be looking at David, who became the new king of Israel. So in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1 through 3, says, Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, You shall shepherd my people Israel, and be ruler over Israel. Therefore all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So in these three verses, you're going to notice that the term all is used three times, actually right through verse 5. And when the term all is used, it's emphasizing that the kingdom established under King David was truly a united monarchy. And the elders of Israel, they represented the tribes, and they went to David at Hebron with the purpose of submitting to his rule. And three reasons were given by the Israelites for wanting to make David king. And he was the Israelite brother. He was Israel's best warrior and commander. And most importantly, they wanted David as king because he was chosen by the Lord to be the king of Israel. And David bound himself formally to certain obligations toward the Israelites, including their responsibilities and their rights to one another and to the Lord. And the covenant was good, but it did not end the underlying sense of separate identity felt by Israel and Judah as the result of the revolt of Judah, as we'll see in the next few weeks when we go into chapter 20, verse 1. And also the dissolution of the United Kingdom under Rehoboam in 1 Kings 12, verse 16. Would later demonstrate. And David's third anointed resulted in the unification of the 12 tribes under his kingship. And verse 4 and 5 says, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So the United Kingdom was still unknown by its two component parts. And Samuel anointed David approximately at 15 years old, which left him 15 years in preparation for the throne. And David reigned as king, we see, for 40 years. In verse 6 through 8 says, And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who spoke to David, saying, You should not come in here, but the blind and the lame will repel you, thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. Now David said on that day, Whoever climbs up by way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Therefore, they say, the blind and the lame should not come into the house. So, by taking Jerusalem, David was able to eliminate the foreign wedge between the northern and southern tribes, and to also establish his capital. And the Jebusites in the Bible, they were the people of Canaan, and they taunted the Israelites. They mocked David's power by boasting that the blind and the lame could defend Jerusalem against him. And we see Zion for the very first time being mentioned here in the Bible. And it's going to be the only time you see it mentioned within the books of 1st or 2nd Samuel. And you may recall hearing the city of David before, which is also better known as Bethlehem. And as we know, coming up very, very shortly in the next few weeks, as we get Turkey Day out of the way, we're going to be focusing on a whole month of the birth of Christ. So Bethlehem is the birthplace of David and Jesus. And a water shaft was a tunnel that channeled the city's water supply from the Gihon Spring outside the city walls on the east side of the citadel. In verse 9 and 10 says, Then David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the city of David, and David built all around from the Millo and inward. So David went on and became great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. And so stone-filled terraces were built to serve as part of Jerusalem's northern defenses, since the city was mostly open to attack from that direction. And David came to greatness as God was with him. In verse 11 and 12, Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons, and they built David a house. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of the people Israel. So Tyre was a Phoenician port, a city that was approximately 35 miles north of Mount Carmel and 25 miles south of Sidon. And Hiram later in David's reign traded building materials for agricultural products. And he also provided craftsmen to build David's palace. And that would indicate how long the war had been brought to the nation to a low place where there were few good artisans. And Psalm chapter 30 could refer possibly to the dedication of this house, or the temporary shelter for the Ark of the Lord in Jerusalem. And witnessing God's evident blessings on his life, we see that David recognized that the Lord's role in establishing his kingship. In verse 13 through 16 says, And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he had come from Hebron. Also more sons and daughters were born to David. Now these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhah, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. So we see the multiplication here of David's wives and concubines. And if we remember from the law of Moses, this was a direct violation of the command that God gave in Deuteronomy 17:17. And these marriages probably reflected David's involvement in international treaties and alliances that were sealed by the marriage of a king's daughter to the other participants of the treaty. And the cultural institution accounted for some of David's and many of Solomon's wives, as you can find in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1 through 3. And in each case here of polygamy in Scripture, we know that the law of God was violated. And every time that you see polygamy in the Bible, many critics will, really nitpick at the Bible over it. But every time you see polygamy used in the Bible, it does not end well for those who are wrapped up in that sin. And it was oftentimes disastrous. And we're going to see the effects of David's sin with polygamy throughout our study here in 2 Samuel. In verse 17 through 19 says, Now when the Philistines heard that they anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. The Philistines also went and deployed themselves in the valley of Ephraim. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, Go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into your hand. And so for the remainder of the chapter, we're going to see the description given of David's military victories. And the Philistines were quiet neighbors during the civil war between the house of Saul and David. And once again, David was not their servant. They took decisive military action against David's new capital of Jerusalem. And the Valley of Rephaim means Valley of the Giants. And it was a plain that was located southwest of Jerusalem on the border between Judah and Benjamin, where fertile land produced grain that provided food for Jerusalem, but it also attracted the raiding armies. And David, we see that David was blessed, and when he sought God, he looked to God for guidance. In verse 20-21, so David went to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, "The Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breakthrough of water." Therefore he called the name of that place Baal Perazim. And they left their images there, and David and his men carried them away. And so the image seen in the name of Baal Perazim was that of flooding waters, like that of breaking through a dam, as David's troops had broken through the Philistines' assault. And the idols of the Philistines had taken into battle to assure them the victory that was captured by the Israelites and burned, as you can find in 1 Chronicles chapter 14 and verse 12. In verse 22-25, to wrap up the chapter, says, "Then the Philistines went up once again and deployed themselves in the valley of the Rephaim. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, and he said, 'You should not go up, circle around behind them, and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then you shall advance quickly. For then the Lord will go out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines.' And David did so as the Lord commanded him, and he drove back the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer." And so, once again, we see that David sought the Lord for guidance, and God directed him differently in this battle, and it might not even make sense to you. And at the battle of Rephaim, David waited for the Lord to strike the camp of the enemy first. And the sign of the Lord's work was the sound of the march of the leaves of the mulberry trees, rustling at the slightest movement of air, much of which would be generated by a large marching army. And maybe you get that childhood song, that mulberry tree song, stuck in your head when you think of mulberry trees. But Geba, it was located approximately 5 miles north of Jerusalem, and Gezer was 20 miles west of Geba. And David drove the Philistines out of the hill country back to the coastal plain. And so, to wrap up our chapter for today, we see that the elders of Israel finally all come to agreement, unified, as recognizing David as king over Israel. And your homework is to check out 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 23-40, to see a great assembly that took place to recognize David as king. And if you don't want to do that homework, that's fine. I'm sure we're going to hit that passage next year. And this is amazing, as only one tribe, if you recall, recognized David as king before. And we are shown during the duration of David's reign and the capture of Jerusalem. And we see the city of David is mentioned, which was the birthplace of David and one other significant person in the Bible. And we're going to look at Luke chapter 2, verse 4-7. And this passage might come to mind as the passage of Jesus Christ, and that is absolutely correct. And so, in the upcoming month, we're going to be reflecting on the birth of Christ. But in Luke chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." So we see that Jesus descended from the line of David, and Jesus was born in the same place that David was born in Bethlehem. And Jerusalem became the capital city of David. And we hear of David's palace and greatness, as well as the not so great things of him, known as his polygamous lifestyle. And we see that David fought against Israel's old enemies, and he defeated the Philistines. And that's going to wrap up today's video, and we'll see you next, I think our next video will be Friday this week, where we're going to be looking at David bringing the Ark of God into Jerusalem. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless. We'll see you Friday.